show you some things that I don't think you even knew existed. It goes against everything Manifest Destiny teaches about Native Americans. And I want you to know this part of our history because people erased it. And we'll get to that later on in the program. Erased it intentionally. Erased it intentionally. That's an important part of it.
Welcome to Seven Trumpets Prepper, and to this very important and very special video that I'm doing covering who the true biblical Hebrews are. I first off want to say, as if the warning at the beginning of the video wasn't enough, I want to make sure and reiterate this, that I'm not a racist person, nor am I a person that hates certain individuals. I love all of humanity. I want to see all of humanity making a new kingdom. But nevertheless, there is true Hebrews. There is a true people of the Most High that is scattered throughout the nations of the earth this day. It is not whom that many people believe they are, such as the so-called Jews in the nation-state of Israel that we so see before us right now. I would interject that the true biblical Hebrews are the so-called African-American people that are scattered abroad throughout the world. Now, I will show you through a mass amount of evidence that I'll put up on the screen right here. It is very important that you understand who the true Hebrews are, because that end-time prophecy, lots of it, surround these individuals. I am a Gentile. I know exactly who I am, but it seems to be the one group of people in the world that have been, by the rest of the world, tried to be dumbed down to the fact or completely erase their history from history, is the African American people, so-called, that are scattered throughout the nations. Now, please understand that not every single black person is a true Hebrew, but it is those that are under the curse of Deuteronomy 28. And you'll be able to tell by the time that I'm done giving you this information, this video, who the true Hebrews are. And you may be one of them. And you may be one of them. And you may be one of them.
I want you to ask these questions. Was Jackson right? Andrew Jackson, Manifest Destiny, the beginning of that. Was he right that the Native Americans were savages? Or was Jefferson right that there was something going on here that we don't even understand? Maybe they were descendants of Egyptians or Jews, or maybe they were from Asia. Where were these people from? But they weren't savages.
Reading from the Archives of Aboriginal Knowledge, containing all the original papers laid before Congress. Before Congress, respecting the history, antiquities, language, ethnology, pictography, rites, superstitions, and mythology of the Indian tribes of the United States by Henry R. Schoolcraft, LL.D., with illustrations in 6 volumes. This is volume 1. And it says here, in regard to the manners, customs, habits of the wild tribes of the Western Territory, a true and more correct type than any I have ever seen may be found in the ancient history of the Jews or Israelites after their liberation from Egyptian bondage. The medicine lodge of the Indian may be compared to the place of worship or tabernacle of the Jews, and the sacrifices, offerings, purifications, ablutions, and anointings may be all found amongst and practiced by those people. The customs of Indian women at certain periods and after childbearing are almost those of the Jewish women. They have to undergo a probation of a certain number of days on all such occasions, besides ablutions and purifications, before they are considered fit to enter on their domestic duties. During this probation they are considered unclean and altogether unfit to enter the lodge or join with the family, which indeed they never attempt, but erect a hut for themselves, when they remain the whole time, having their food brought to them. The manner of mourning for a deceased relative is very similar to that of the Israelites. In such cases, the men will cast. From the book Israelite and Indian, a parallel in planes of culture. Address of Garrick Mallory, Vice President, Section H of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Toronto meeting, August 1889. Alright, this is an address from Garrick Mallory, Vice President of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Gary says, many authors have contended that the North American Indians were descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Prominent among them was James Adair, whose work highly useful with regard to the customs of the southeastern Indians, among whom he spent many years, was mainly devoted to proof of the proposition. So we do have a book from James Adair, and we're going to go into it later. The Reverend Ethan Smith is also conspicuous, and even the last book discussing the Indians published last year, bearing the comprehensive title The American Indian, favors the same theory. The authors of the school mentioned have for their excuse the fact, which I freely admit with greater emphasis, that an outstanding number of customs of the North American Indians are the same as those recorded of the ancient Hebrews, but the lesson to be derived from the parallel between the Indians and the Israelites is very different from that of a descent advocated.
Let me show you one more connection. In 1860, David Wyrick, he's a guy who surveyed the Newark earthworks. He was digging into a mound near those earthworks, and he found a wooden coffin made of oak. They opened up the coffin and found a skeleton of a man holding a little box. It was about 8.10 inches in size. The box had been cemented shut here. This, by the way, is sitting in Ohio. Well, he opened up the box and he found a little man inside, a little black stone. They took it to scholars and they looked at it. The man seems to be carrying something, and there's writing here at first they couldn't recognize. The writing is, they thought in 1860, some sort of Hebrew. Well, finally, about 20 years later, they found some rabbis living in the area, and the rabbis looked at that, and they could read it. They said it was an old kind of block Hebrew, and it was a rendition of the Ten Commandments. Now, this is another piece. Block Hebrew. They said they'd never seen anything like it. Mainstream archaeologists at the time called this a hoax. But then in 1900, or just about after 1900, in Israel, they found the same block-style Hebrew writing. Mainstream archaeologists still dismissed the findings. They found it in Israel, and they found it in Ohio. But there was another stone that they found that they couldn't argue. This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee. Since it came from Cherokee country, they didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew. They had published this originally upside down. They threw it in a box at the bottom of the Smithsonian, put it in the basement. Many years later, a scholar took it out of the box, looked at it, and went, oh my gosh, it's upside down. It's Phoenician, ancient Hebrew. So what's going on here? What is that about? Where is that history? I'll show you in a few minutes, and we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to show you some more things that the Smithsonian, science, government, commerce colluded to erase.
Hey, so shout out to Glenn Beck. He said that before he got fired from Fox, and whatever his reasons, hey, it helps, man. It's all part of the wave, right? We're surfing. It's all part of Hawa, increasing the knowledge, right? Daniel 12:4. William Penn gave the clue to many subsequent biblical scholars in declaring that he had found in the American Indians the lost tribes of Israel. The superficial resemblance between the two peoples was so striking that he was led to say, "When I look at their children, I imagine myself in the Jewish quarter of London." The Reverend J. Wesley Ina says in Science Herald in Boston that as late as 1889, a well-informed representative of the Moshkoki tribe, Moshkoki or Meshkoki Moscow, when questioned concerning the legends of his people, replied, "They are all in the Old Testament. Read them there without the trouble of taking them down from our people." Corroborative of this is the statement of Dr. W. W. Warren in his History of the Ojibwe Nation, that in response to the parts of the Bible which he translated for this people, they said, "The book must be true, for our ancestors have told us the same stories for generations." It's called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. Alright, so now we're in this book. It's called The History of the American Indian. Alright, and again, And it says here, particularly those nations adjoining to the Mississippi, East and West Florida, Georgia, South and North Carolina, and Virginia, containing an account of their origin, language, manners, religious, civil customs, laws, form of government, punishments, conduct in war, domestic life, their habits, diet, agriculture, manufactures, disease, and methods of cure, and other particulars sufficient to render it a, a complete Indian system, with observations on former historians, the conduct of our colony governors, superintendents, missionaries. All right, so this is written by James Adair, Esquire, a trader with the Indians and resident in their country for 40 years. All right, James Adair lived with them for 40 years with your Aboriginal ancestors. All right, so you think he didn't learn something from them or notice something from them? So let's see what he has to say. All right, so real quick before I continue with the book, I just wanted to talk about who James Adair was, so you can know exactly what we're reading and who his views, why he has these views in this book, right? So it says here in this book, Biographical Dictionary, projected and partly arranged, by Reverend Hugh James Rose, Principal of King's College London, Volume 1. This was written in 1857. All right, and it says here in the book under James Adair, right? It says a trader with the Indians of the southern states. He resided in their country for 40 years. Again, 40 years. First-hand account, all right? First-hand account, his experience with them, all right? Beginning in 1735 and was almost entirely cut off from civilized society. And from the year 1744, he resided chiefly among the Chickasaws. He published a very elaborate work on their manners, endeavoring to prove them descended from the Jews. So his whole book, and I read that he was persuaded by Benjamin Franklin to go ahead and write it after conversating with him in London, that he wrote it again, right, to prove that the Indians, well, at least the ones he was around in those 40 years, to prove that they descended from the Jews, or Hebrews, not Jews, right? Hebrews, or what they call Hebrews, or the people they write about in the Old Testament, right? It's not what you call yourself, but we just got to use these tags, right? So we can know, so we can reference what we're talking about here. All right, it is entitled The History of the American Indian, Encyclopedia Alabama. It says James Adair authored what is arguably the most significant 18th century work on the southeastern Indians. The History of the American Indians, published in London in 1775. The book, a cultural and historical study of the Catawba, all my Catawba family out there, Cherokee family, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw family out there listening. He lived amongst your ancestors for 40 years. So can we trust what he's writing about how they lived? Again, so a study of all these nations, right, which is based on Adair's first-hand observation, derived from his 40-year career as a deerskin trader among several southeastern Indian tribes. And in this book, A Nation Now Extinct, American Indian Origin Theories as of 1820 by Samuel Mitchell and Martin Harris. And it says here, by far the most persuasive of all Americans to defend the Lost Tribes theory was the historian and anthropologist James Adair, a historian and anthropologist. He wasn't just a trader. All right, he knew what he was talking about. Who, following the tradition of the great French-Canadian missionary Pierre Francois Chalaveau, spent 40 years among the American Indians. In his History of the American Indians, Adair was perhaps the first to argue less on biblical grounds and more on scientific basis that the Indians had originated from the Jewish stock. Refuting the pre-Adamite theory, he believed that the Indians have lineally descended from Adam. Adair carefully observed the Indian cultures, their rites, festivals, religious ceremonies, their monotheistic beliefs in the one God of the Great Spirit, their reckoning of time, the traditions of sacred men and prophets, their levirate marriages, their anointings and purification ceremonies, and other practices and beliefs. His thorough anthropological observations, systematic research, and comparative analysis were certainly impressive, even if later scholars disagreed with him. Adair infused the Lost Tribes theory with a scientific foundation it had sorely lacked. So, science behind this. All right? So now let's go back to the book. And James Adair began saying, "It is a very difficult thing to divert ourselves, not to say other persons, of prejudices and favored opinions." Right? And I expect to be censored by some for opposing commonly received sentiments, or for meddling with a dispute agitated among the learned ever since the first discovery of America. But truth is my object, and I hope to offer some things which, if they do not fully solve the problem, may lead the way and enable others possessing stronger judgment. All right, he's talking about us researching and waking up, right? He's trying to lead the way. He's just trying to put down information and see where you can take it, where you go with it. All right, but do your own research, right? More learning and more leisure to accomplish it. As I before suggested, where we have not the light of history or records to guide us through the dark maze of antiquity, we must endeavor to find it out by probable arguments. And in such subjects of inquiry, where no material objections can be raised against probability, again, in the subjects of inquiry where no material objections can be raised. So if you don't got no proof or any facts to disprove what we're saying, against this probability, which is more fact, there's more correlation to what we're saying, right? More probability. It is strongly conclusive of the truth and nearly gives the thing sought for. And now listen to this. This is where he continues. He says, "From the most exact observations I could make in the long time I traded among the Indian Americans, I was forced to believe them lineally descended from the Israelites." All right? You understand? You hear what he's saying? He lived with them 40 years. So you think he's just making up things? All right? Columbus brought a Hebrew interpreter, right? This is the true old world. We might have the Garden of Eden, most likely we do, wherever that vortex is, that energy point, that beginning, Utah, South America, North Pole, many different Edens, right? But where is it all pointing, right? Over here, Atlantis, right? So-called Atlantis. Now, James Adair is telling you, after 40 years of living with the Aborigines, he was forced to believe. He had to know. He knew them lineally descended from the Israelites, either while they were a maritime power or soon after the general captivity. The latter, however, is the most probable. This descent I shall endeavor to prove from their religious rites. All right, James Adair is going to prove it to you. How? Well, through their religious rites, civil and martial customs, their marriages, funeral ceremonies, manners, language, traditions, and a variety of particulars, which will at the same time make the reader thoroughly acquainted with nations, of which it may be said to this day very little have been known. They haven't told you anything yet. So let's learn, let's remember.
Later, many other artifacts would turn up that suggested the presence of Middle Eastern cultures in North America.
Protestant priests, Catholic fathers, Jewish rabbis were seeing these possible links between the Native Americans and ancient Israel. These links included written records that had possible tie-ins to the ancient world.
There were certainly religious beliefs, thinking that the Native Americans may have been descendants of some Hebraic, Jewish, Israelite travelers to the Americas at different times, or of other Old World peoples at different times. And there are various things fueling these. There were religious, political, and social agendas.
Perhaps the largest documented religious artifact was this ancient city wall mound, recorded in Squire and Davis's Smithsonian publication entitled Ancient Monuments of of the Mississippi Valley.
So to see an artifact like that, or the context in which they would place an artifact like that, would be, especially something found in association with the mounds, would be, oh, that shows to us the presence of these people at that time here in the Americas. They were responsible for creating that artifact. They were responsible for creating the mounds and for introducing various cultural aspects into the Americas.
The idea that ancient inhabitants knew of and used Middle Eastern Hebrew symbols undermined the notion that Native Americans were isolated savages. It also conflicted with the emerging science of the day and would mark the beginning of a long-standing controversy.
Discourse on the evidences of the American Indians being the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, delivered before the Mercantile Library Association, Clinton Hall by M. Noah, 1837. It is, however, in the religious belief and ceremonies of the Indians that I propose showing some of the evidences of their being, as it is believed, the descendants of the dispersed tribes. This opinion is founded, first, in their belief in one God, second, in the computation of time by their ceremonies of the new moon, third, in their division of the year in 4 seasons, answering to the Jewish festivals of the Feast of Flowers, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of the Tabernacle, and other religious holidays. Fourth, in the erection of a temple after the manner of our temple, and having an ark of the covenant, and also the erection of altars. Fifth, by the division of the nation into tribes, with a chief or grand sachem at their head. Sixth, by their laws of sacrifices, ablutions, marriages, ceremonies in war and peace, the prohibitions of eating certain things, fully carrying out the Mosaic institutions, by their traditions, history, character, appearance, affinity of their language to the Hebrew, and finally by that everlasting covenant of heirship exhibited in perpetual transmission of its seal in their flesh. If I shall be able to satisfy your doubts and curiosity on these points, you will certainly rejoice with me in discovering that the dispersed of the chosen people are not the lost ones, that the promises held out to them have been thus far realized, and that all the prophecies relative to their future destination will in due time be strictly fulfilled. Again, they're talking about you, that all your prophecies relative to the future, your future destination, will in due time be strictly fulfilled. Reading from the book Letters and Notes of the Manners and Customs and Conditions of the North American Indians by George Catlin. Alright, George Catlin, he lived amongst the natives as well. We got him in some of the videos. Says here, I am compelled to believe that the continent of America and each of the other continents have had their aboriginal stocks. Alright, so he's saying that America had aboriginals just like in Africa and Australia and any other place, peculiar in color and in character, and that each of these native stocks has undergone repeated mutations, at periods of which history has kept no records, by erratic colonies from abroad that have been engrafted upon them, mingling with them and materially affecting their original character. By this process, I believe that the North American Indians, even where we find them in their wildest condition, are several degrees removed from their original character, and that one of their principal alloys had been a part of those dispersed people who have mingled their blood and their customs with them, and even in their new disguise, seem destined to be followed up with oppression and endless persecution. The first and most striking fact amongst the North American Indians that refers us to the Jews is that of their worshiping in all parts the Great Spirit, or Jehovah. Dash the hijack, we're going to see it's more like Jehovah, as the Hebrews were ordered to do by this divine precept, instead of a plurality of gods, as ancient pagans and heathens did in their idols of their own formation. The North American Indians are nowhere idolaters. They appeal at once to the Great Spirit and know of no mediator, either personal or symbolical. You hear that, right? No mediator between the Most High and you. no Jesus, no mediator, either personal or symbolical, no images, symbolical in any way. Isaiah 43, right? Only one Savior, the Most High. The Indian tribes are everywhere divided into bands with chiefs, symbols, badges, and many of their modes of worship I have found exceedingly like those of the Mosaic institution. The Jews had their sanctum sanctorums, and so may it be said that Indians have in their council or medicine houses, which are always held as sacred places. As the Jews had, they have their high priests and their prophets. Among the Indians, as amongst the ancient Hebrews, the women are not allowed to worship with the men, and in all cases also they eat separately. The Indian everywhere, like the Jews, believe that they are favored people of the Great Spirit, and they are certainly like those ancient people persecuted, as every man's hand seems raised against them, and they, like the Jews, destined to be dispersed over the world and seemingly scorched by the Almighty and despised of man. In their marriages, the Indians, as did the ancient Jews, uniformly buy their wives by giving presents, and in many tribes they very closely resemble them in other forms and ceremonies of their marriages. In their preparations for war and in peacemaking, they are strikingly similar. In their treatment of the sick, burial of the dead, and mourning, they are also similar. Their bathing and ablutions at all seasons of the year as a part of their religious observances, having separate places for men and women to perform these immersions, they resemble again, and the custom amongst the women of absenting themselves during the lunar influences is exactly consonant to the Mosaic law. This custom of separation is uniform, one amongst the different tribes, as far as I have seen them in their primitive state, and be it Jewish, natural, or conventional, it is indispensable form with these wild people who are setting to the civilized world this and many other examples of decency and propriety, only to be laughed at by their wiser neighbors, who rather than award to the red man any merit for them, have taken exceeding pains to call them but the results of ignorance and superstition. After this season of separation, purification in running water, and anointing, precisely in accordance with the Jewish command, is requisite before she can enter the family lodge. Such is one of the extraordinary observances among these people in their wild state. But along the frontier, where white people have laughed at them for their forms, they have departed from this, as from nearly everything else that is native and original about them. You don't do it anymore. In their feasts, fastings, and sacrificing, they are exceedingly like those ancient people. Many of them have a feast closely resembling the annual feast of the Jewish Passover, and amongst others, an occasion much like the Israelitish feast of the Tabernacles, which lasted 8 days, when history tells us they carried bundles of willow boughs and fasted several days. And
many believe that the Native Americans had no written record prior to Christopher Columbus. This would make it prehistory, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Artifacts containing what appears to be written language excited great controversy when they were originally discovered. According to the scholarly journal of the Ohio Historical Society, quote, "No subject received more attention or stirred more controversy among archaeologists in the 19th century than the authenticity and presumed meaning of the engraved stone tablets that were periodically recovered from the mounds. Some members of the Ohio Association were among the staunchest defenders of a so-called lost race theory, and many had little doubt that the mound builders were descended from one of the ancient civilizations of Europe or the Middle East, most likely the seafaring Phoenicians of Hebrew or Mediterranean origin. Was the scientific community reacting to these origin ideas? Dr. Stephen Peet may have thought so, and actually charged wanton destruction of the mounds. Whether intentional or not, whether motivated by religious or political agendas or not, modern experts agree that wanton destruction did occur.
The Seminoles of Florida by Minnie Moore Wilson. Alright, so in this book, it's going to basically correlate a lot of the information we've already gone before in past videos. So let's just go into it so you can see what I'm talking about. So we go to page 118, relationship to the Aztecs and Eastern tribes. Jave, or Jaweh, or Jawa, Hawa. Today, the antiquarian may lay aside his musty parchments of antiquity and in the heart of the big Everglades, study the history of an ancient people through living authors. Yahweh, Yahweh, Jehovah, Jehovah, or Hawa, monotone, yet rhythmical, the brown-faced singers, again, brown-faced singers, chanted the hymn. Over and over again were the words repeated by the Seminole choir, till the word Yahweh, mystical and the centuries past, dwelt with the listener. None but a Hebrew scholar would have caught the word with an understanding of its meaning. The occasion was a 4th of July celebration when the retired Reverend W. M. Gray was visiting the Seminole mission at Immokalee, situated near the western border of the Florida Everglades. The Indians, full of confidence and kindly feeling, had consented to sing, and here appeared the wonderful, yes, startling observation made by Bishop Gray. Yahweh is the Hebrew word meaning Jehovah or Hawa, a word held in such awe by the children of Israel, and as claimed by scholars too sacred to pass the lips of a man that even its correct pronunciation is unknown. Alright, so they don't know how it's pronounced. So Hawa, right? There was no V's in ancient Paleo Hebrew. If you go to the letter of the Vav, they have the V today, it was Wa, the sound. Alright, so let's continue. It says, today in the weird fastnesses of the Everglades, a band of wild Indians chant the name of the great Jehovah or Hawa in the Hebrew tongue, a name that is meaningless in its original form to thousands of educated Americans. When questioned by Bishop Gray as to the meaning of the sacred word, the Indian answered, God, white man's God. The question now appeals to the scientist, to the antiquarian, and to the theologian. From whence came the Seminoles' knowledge of the word? From its use in the death of the Everglades, one may work back to the prehistoric ruined temples of Mexico and Yucatan, so similar to those of Egypt. Again, the prehistoric ruined temples of Mexico and Yucatan, so similar to those of Egypt, and thus may find in Seminole speech a language linked to connect the New World with the Old. Is this single word, as verified by Bishop Gray, the keynote to the history and origin of the North American Indian? Continuing, Prescott in his History of Mexico refers to some traditions of the Aztecs as bearing a singular resemblance to those found in the scriptures. More or less does one start with surprise and awe, as he notes in the Indians of Florida a strict observance of those customs as well as religious beliefs as laid down in the book of Leviticus. Not the least startling, after 34 centuries, do we find the Seminole observing the rigid laws of health as laid down to the children of Israel after the Exodus. With reference to the preservation of health, we find in the scriptures that those affected by disease were separated from the tribe, and as health returned, we read Leviticus 15:13. Then shall he number himself 7 days for his cleansing, and wash his clothes, and bathe his flesh in running water, and be clean. Verse 7. And whoever touches the flesh of him shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Note the following. On a recent visit to the Seminole camps, and after receiving warm welcome from the squaws and pickaninnies of former acquaintances, a solitary figure who observed sitting in a small detached wigwam, approaching for the purpose of shaking hands. From all sides came gesticulations and dissenting tones from the squaws, and feeling that the woman was a prisoner or taking some kind of punishment, we passed on. During a visit of 3 days at the camps, the squaws was kept aloof from the band, receiving all necessary attention with the kindliest spirit, but fulfilling the law of Moses. Again, fulfilling the law of Moses, Muskogeans, Musko, Meshech, Moses, Meshi, as recorded in Leviticus, and she shall be apart 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean. The Aztecs made crimes against society capital among their registered laws. Adultery was punishable, as with the Jews, by death, or Hebrews, right? The same laws hold good among the Seminoles today. Marriage laws are held sacred, but divorces are permitted where some incompatibility of temper is found. This is done after the manner of the old Jews. Out of mercy to the woman, either party may marry again, but the marriage must be with the approval of the leaders of the band. Those who know some of the habits of the Florida Indians or Seminoles are cognizant of the fact that they will not eat green corn until the second day of the annual feast. On a visit to the camps, old Chief Tallahassee was invited to join his white friends at dinner, and he was offered a roasting ear. Ear is or a corn, right? He said, "Me not eat green corn, shakaita, green corn dance, eat plenty." Pointing to a small patch of corn from which the ears had been stripped, he said, "Squaws eat corn, plenty men no eat." And as we read Leviticus 23:14, the thought comes, is the law, though divested of part of its meaning, being fulfilled today by a band of wild Indians? "And ye shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day ye brought an offering to the Lord," or Hawa. Another link is a feast day, which seems to correspond in its rites to the Day of Atonement. On old Jewish days, attached to the assembling of the band, prevents little insight from the outside world. With only an oral tradition, with their unwritten but priceless history of an ancient race, with the white man daily encroaching on their last domain, the time for studying this primitive people in their purity will soon be over. And of their customs and usages, where is the Sidippus of this day? Who shall solve the riddle of their origin? My people, who shall solve the riddle of their origin? That's up to us.
The history that has been erased in our nation, and in particular with the Native Americans, happened because it didn't fit the story they created, Manifest Destiny. It only works when Indians were savages, and they had to have savages for commerce and government to expand. The ancient artifacts prove otherwise. Why aren't we looking into those? Peter